We are back again with On the Money Line, a podcast by MMA Play 365. I'm your host Newsome, and we're back at the UFC Apex for UFC Vegas 32, and we finally get the return of TJ Dillashaw after 2.5 years out of action due to a serious USADA suspension after getting popped for EPO. But the UFC have thrown Dillashaw right back into the top of the division, and he'll be fighting the surging Cory Sandhagen in the main event of the night. It's also worth mentioning that we have the highly anticipated fight between Dr. Pepper and Reese's Chocolate as the people's main event, with Adrian Yanez fighting Randy Costa. These two fighters have created massive hype between them, and that fight is going to be nothing short of electric. But just before we get into those breakdowns, as always, there's a few things to mention in regards to MMA Play 365. The last event was very thin from a betting perspective, but we did cash our only bet of the night, a big bet on Mateusz Gamrot, who finished Jeremy Stephens in 65 seconds. The money back guarantee dog of the week was Billy Quarantillo, who finished Gabriel Benitez, so that was another good result. And then 9 out of 12 of the fun parlay options won as well. So a decent night overall. Remember, we have multiple betting packages on the MMA Play 365 website for all the UFC betting advice and DraftKings FanDuel advice that you'll ever need. We also have various subscription lengths and options too, so to see our full service list, please go and visit MMAplay365.com for more information or to sign up today. And let's break down some fights. In the main event of the night, we've got Cory Sandhagen versus the returning TJ Dillashaw. Sandhagen is currently the -190 favourite. The comeback on Dillashaw at +165 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the money line, I honestly think the line's quite accurate. I do feel that Sandhagen is a better bet at -190 than Dillashaw at +165, just purely to do with all the red flags that's going to come with Dillashaw in this fight. So the line is accurate, but I do think the -190 is the better bet than the +169 of the underdog. As for where the line moves throughout fight week, there's been a ton of money coming in on Sandhagen all week. He was down at -175, -165 earlier in the week, but I think people are seeing the same issues and the red flags with Dillashaw. It's causing money to come in on Sandhagen. I do think it can only go so far though. I think if it hits -200, -210, then that's going to be a brick wall. I think naturally the public will put some money on Dillashaw, bringing it back down a little bit. Ultimately, come fight night on Saturday night though, I think that Sandhagen's going to close at around the -190, the -195, where he's roughly sitting right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, the first thing we've got to talk about is the obvious red flags, which I've been speaking about. I did put something out on Twitter earlier in the week about it. I just feel that there's a lot of red flags on Dillashaw. First of all, he's coming back after a suspension from USADA for the use of an illegal substance. Now, the illegal substance was EPO, and it's one of the most effective performance-enhanced drugs that a fighter in mixed martial arts can use. So there are other PEDs that maybe aren't as effective but still illegal and fighters still get popped, but EPO is so effective from a cardio, strength, power perspective. It really does enhance your body for everything that you would need from solid attributes in MMA. Like I say, the cardio, freakish cardio, the strength, then the power, and it's all things that Dillashaw, all attributes that Dillashaw had in his fight. So it's going to be really interesting to see how Dillashaw looks coming back into the cage without having those enhanced attributes and without having that substance in his body. So that's the first red flag for a start. The second red flag, 2.5 years out the sport, coming back into the cage. Is there going to be some ring rust? And then is he going to be the same fighter as what he once was? Then it's the fact he's a 35-year-old bantamweight. So when you start putting all this together, he's going to have a clean body. He's coming in 2.5 years away from the sport. He's 35 years old. Is he going to be the same fighter? Those are 3 really big red flags that could definitely impact the fight, in my opinion. So that's the first thing that we've got to cover. Now, if TJ Dillashaw, if we see the TJ Dillashaw of the past, if he doesn't look any different, then honestly, the +165 number on him is just going to look ridiculous because the fight will definitely be closer than that. But even if we do see the same TJ Dillashaw, I still think Cory Sandhagen stylistically can cause big problems for Dillashaw. Dillashaw's obviously got his wrestling. I feel that he's got to go to the wrestling in this fight. He's got a wrestling background. He does have good takedowns. He does have a good top game as well. But I don't think that Sandhagen's going to have too many issues in regards to getting back up to his feet. I definitely think that TJ Dillashaw can take Sandhagen down. I think he will get him down multiple times. But unlike someone like Aljamain Sterling, for example, TJ Dillashaw doesn't have that BJJ quality of what Sterling's got. So Sterling, when he got Sandhagen down to the mat, he was able to scramble to his back. He was able to secure a good position and choke him out. I don't see TJ Dillashaw taking Sandhagen down, taking his back and choking him out. What I see is Dillashaw taking him down, holding him down for a few moments, but Sandhagen's so tricky with his own BJJ defensively. He's good in scrambles. He's good at throwing his legs up for submissions and then using the submission attempts to get back up to his feet. So although Dillashaw will be taking him down, in my opinion, I don't think he's going to be able to hold him down, and that's going to be key because effective striking is the number one criteria when it comes to judges' scorecards. So I feel that with Sandhagen on the feet, with his length, with his reach, I just feel that he's going to cause Sandhagen so many problems. He's the more elusive striker. He's the more creative striker. I think he's going to be faster as well. TJ Dillashaw on the feet is constantly got to be working. He's going to be trying to constantly get inside. He has to, because if he doesn't work his way inside boxing range, then Sandhagen's just going to piece him apart from the outside. So Dillashaw's got to work hard in this fight. He's going to overwork. It's 5 rounds. I feel that favours Sandhagen as well. I think that Sandhagen's really going to start striking with good volume, creativity, getting in on angles, and I think he's going to be a big problem for Dillashaw on the feet, which is why I said that I feel that Dillashaw's got to go to his wrestling, but I don't think that wrestling is going to be enough over 5 rounds. He would have to put on a BJJ clinic as well, which I just don't think that he's going to be able to do against Sandhagen. So stylistically, forgetting all the red flags, forgetting everything about TJ Dillashaw prior to coming into this fight, just when you're looking at this fight from a fighter versus fighter perspective, I think Cory Sandhagen holds stylistic advantages, and it's just then when you add the red flags in from TJ Dillashaw, that is what makes me like Sandhagen in this fight. I'm picking Cory Sandhagen to win this fight. And in the next fight, in the co-main event, we've got Aspen Ladd versus Macy Chiasson. Ladd is currently the -185 favourite. The comeback on Chiasson at +160 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, again, I think it's another fight, and you'll see throughout this episode of the podcast that I say this quite a lot because I think it's a common theme. I do believe that the betting line's quite accurate here, but again, if you're pushing me to which side's a better bet, I do think the -185 on Aspen Ladd holds more value than the +160 of Macy Chiasson. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, Aspen Ladd was again a little bit shorter on the betting line. She was -175 a few days ago. Money's coming on her. It pushed her up to around -200, but slowly money's coming back in on Chiasson, so there's a little bit of fluctuation there. Ultimately, when they step into the cage on Saturday night, I think that the betting lines aren't going to be too far off from where they're sitting right about now. Now, as for how this fight plays out, for me, it's clear why Aspen Ladd is the favourite in this fight. You know, I feel that she's fought better competition. I think she's more well-rounded. I think she's more experienced as well, and that's really key here. I do like Chiasson as a fighter, but I also think that she still has moments where she looks relatively green inside the cage. And in time, with experience, she'll develop and she'll become a better fighter. I've got no doubt that she's going to be one of the top fighters in the coming years. She's still young. She's still going to be developing. But Aspen Ladd's also young as well. She's also still developing. And just right now, I feel that she's the better fighter in this fight. Now, with Macy Chiasson, I do definitely think that she's going to have her moments because she is tall. She does fight long. She is strong in the clinch as well. But it's just some things with Chiasson, it does make me question that, yep, she needs to develop in that area, and one of them is fighting off her back. So Chiasson will look for takedowns herself, and she's got decent top control, and she's dangerous on top as well with the ground and pound. But when she's the one on her back, she can look a little lost. Maybe not straight away. She does look like she's quite active early on and trying to get back up to her feet. But if she's taken down 2 or 3 times, then she does get to the point where she starts getting a little bit stuck on her back. And the thing is with Aspen Ladd, she's really well-rounded, so she's also aggressive on the feet. She will also crash forward, land hard punches, land kicks. She's not going to shy away away from that. But the difference is, if it does get a little bit too much for either fighter, then it's Aspen lad that's going to be the one that's more likely to level change, drop down for a takedown, and look to get the fight down to the mat. And that's where lad's biggest advantage is for me in this fight. If she can get Chiasson down and get on top of her, I think she'll be able to work her with ground and pound submission attempts. And like I said, I think Chiasson will be able to get back up to her feet maybe once or twice. But if lad really just sticks to it, and if this is in a game plan, then I do think the longer the fight goes on, the more success she'll have. My only pause and my only concern from Aspen lad's perspective is she has been in these types of fights before where she holds so many stylistic advantages and the fights just end up so close. They go to a judge's scorecard and you're sort of not sure where the judge is going to see it, and then it might even be a split decision. And it's those types of fights where you actually want to be on the underdog side, the plus money side. So that is always a pause for concern. But when I'm looking at the raw skills and the stylistic advantages in this fight, I do think that lad has a lot of upside. For those reasons, I'm picking Aspen lad to win this fight. And in the next fight, this should be a fun one. We've got Phillips versus Raulian Paiva. Phillips is currently the -260 favourite. The comeback on Paiva at +120 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, once again, I think the line's relatively accurate. I understand it. I get why Phillips is a big favourite in this fight. Obviously, his last fight, I was one of what seems like not many people that cashed him at plus money against Song Yadong. He's a phenomenal fighter, and I understand why the line's this high, because coming off a good win against somebody like Song Yadong, who was a big favourite in that fight, it does then widen the betting line for your next fight. So I understand it. And even at -260, I do feel that it's the better bet than the +220 of Paiva, even if you throw in Phillips in a parlay. The sole reason behind it is I've just not really been that impressed with Raulian Paiva. He did show some promise in his UFC debut, but since then, I do feel like his performances have started to fall off a cliff a little bit. Now he is moving up in weight here, so the performances might improve, but from what I've seen, I think Phillips is just a better fighter in this fight with more upside, and for that reason I think the -260 is the better side from a betting perspective. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there has been some fluctuation. Phillips has been up at nearly -300. Money's naturally come back in on Paiva, I get that. I do feel that fluctuation will continue, and I think Phillips will actually come into this fight at around -250, with Raulian Paiva being around +200. Now, as for how this fight plays out, as I've already mentioned, Paiva moving up in weight here, he could look like a different fighter. You don't know what the weight cut was doing to him and things like that, but it's going to be really difficult to beat somebody like Phillips with the skills and the qualities that Paiva has. Paiva's a striker. He will routinely look to his takedowns, but it's not too often, and he can be taken down as well. And this is where I feel that Phillips is just going to have a good time in this fight, because he's a fighter with insane cardio. He can go hard for 3 rounds. He's a dynamic striker. He's in and out of range really quickly, slides well into range, slides back out to avoid danger. But then if things do get a little bit heated, he'll just double leg you and take you down, and he's a legitimate black belt on the mat in BJJ. So for me, wherever this fight goes, Phillips is just going to be really comfortable. And like I say, he can really put that pressure on his opponent and on Paiva for 15 minutes hard. And this is where Paiva is going to come unstuck, because Paiva, he can have a little bit of downtime in fights where his activity just drops for a moment. But it's in those moments that Phillips is really going to be putting the pressure on him. And for Paiva, for me, he's got to stay on the outside. He's got to try and strike inwards. He is tall, he does fight long, so try and strike from the outside, because when everything happens on the inside, that's where Phillips is going to have so many problems. But staying on the outside against Phillips is going to be borderline impossible for 15 minutes, because Phillips will be putting the pressure on. Phillips will be moving forwards, trying to be the aggressor, and he will dictate the pace if Paiva is trying to sit on the outside. So this is where I think stylistically Paiva's going to run into problems. I think that stylistically the fight favours Phillips. I think Phillips is the better striker. I think he's the better wrestler. I think he's the better grappler. I think he's got the better cardio. There's so much upside. It's a really difficult fight for Paiva, in my opinion. I'm picking Phillips to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Darren Elkins versus Darrick Minner. Darrick Minner is currently the -150 favourite. The comeback on Elkins at +130 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Darren Elkins. I don't think Elkins should be a plus money underdog. I think at minimum it should be a pick 'em, but even if Darren Elkins was sitting at -125, I wouldn't think that was a bad line either. So I think the value is on Elkins at +130. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, there has been fluctuation. Elkins actually did open the favourite initially. Instantly there was a line flip. Darrick Minner was the favourite. Money came back in on Elkins, then money came back in on Minner. It's been fluctuating. I expect that to continue throughout fight week, but I do think Darren Elkins will enter the cage still at plus money, maybe at around +120, +125 when they step in the cage on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, all fights start standing, so naturally there will be some striking in this fight, but it's interesting because neither fighter has a game plan that's really surrounded by striking. Both fighters can strike in their own rights, but neither fighter really go into the cage thinking, okay, I'm going to kickbox this dude for 15 minutes. It's not like that with these two. They want to get close to their opponents. They want to score takedowns. They want to grapple. And that's how both fighters fight. So for me, this fight is going to be won and lost on the feet. I don't think it's going to be one of those fights where two wrestlers and grapplers get into the cage and then it turns into a 15-minute kickboxing fight. Someone's going to shoot in this fight. I think both fighters will end up shooting. I think both fighters will end up getting takedowns, and the grappling will be a big factor. Effective striking, I think, will be quite even on the judges' criteria. So then it'll come to effective grappling. The better wrestler and grappler will win the fight. Now, for me, I think that Darrick Minner is very tricky on the mat, especially when it comes to his guillotine attempts. He does really work his guillotine attempts quite well, but then he can also gas himself out by over squeezing. Now, he has moved over with James Krause. James Krause does seem to have got that dropping for a guillotine thing down to a minimum. He didn't really do too much of it against Rosa in that fight that he had the camp with James Krause, and there were so many opportunities that he could have done it with Rosa that I do believe he would have done prior in his career. So maybe he is rounding his grappling game out and not making as many mistakes. And then the other difference that we saw from Darrick Minner with James Krause is his cardio. Notoriously in Darrick Minner's career, he has had big problems with his cardio. He comes out fast and hard in round one. He does good work. He wins the round. If he doesn't get the finish, he wins it on the judges' scorecards. But then he just falls off a cliff halfway through round two, and then he gets absolutely worked. He gets tired to the point where he can't do anything. But we didn't see that against Charles Rosa in his last fight. Now, for me, I'm not totally convinced at all that in just one fight camp with a different coach at a different gym, all your cardio issues have been solved, been resolved and sorted. I don't buy that for 1 minute. I also don't buy the fact that he's not going to drop for a guillotine either. I think what people are seeing in that Rosa fight is very little resistance from Rosa. Rosa didn't really make Minner work. He allowed Minner to have some good top time, some good top positions as well. So giving Minner the opportunity to have good top positions allowed Minner to think, okay, well, I'm not going to go for the guillotine. I'll just get a top position instead. Minner tends to go for the guillotine when there's really no other option. So that sort of counteracts that. Then in regards to the cardio, if you've got little resistance coming back at you, you're not being worked, you're not squeezing for your guillotines, then your cardio is naturally going to look good. I'd have been surprised even with Darrick Minner in his cardio problems if he'd have tired with how that fight played out for him. So I'm not convinced that this is a new Darrick Minner. I think that Elkins is going to be a really tough fight for him. He's going to be the bigger fighter, likely the stronger fighter as well. I think he's the better wrestler. I'm not totally convinced Elkins is the better grappler, but if he's the better wrestler, then he's going to be the one in these top positions. I think Minner is going to have moments in this fight where he's going to go back to squeezing for the guillotine because Elkins is picking him up, he's taking him down. And honestly, that is one aspect Elkins does have to be careful of. I know a lot of people have said, oh, well, he hasn't been submitted for 11 years since Charles Oliveira submitted him. You know, there's no shame in that. That's true. But he's still got to mind his P's and Q's. Just because he hasn't been submitted in 11 years and the last one was Charles Oliveira doesn't mean that Darrick Minner can't get a guillotine and submit Elkins in this fight. It just means that statistically it's quite unlikely. But when Elkins is lifting his opponents up, taking them down, he is normally putting them in a side control position or a half guard position where even if Minner does grab hold of the neck, he's not going to be able to complete a guillotine in those positions. So again, I think stylistically with where I feel that the fight is won and lost, it does favour Elkins. Elkins has got to be careful with the submission attempts because like I say, Minner's BJJ is much trickier than Elkins. But I think Elkins has got a good back take. He's going to have to survive round one though, because he will be taking Minner down in my opinion. Minna will be trying to lock up these submissions, the guillotines, throwing up arm bars from bottom. But I think Minna tires again in this fight. I think we see the cardio of old. I think once the fight gets sort of a couple of minutes into round 2 and then later in round 2 and into round 3, I think Elkins will take over. I'm picking Darren Elkins to win this fight. And in the next fight, I've seen a lot of split opinions on this fight. We've got Maycee Barber versus Miranda Maverick. Maverick is currently the -135 favourite. The comeback on Barber at +115 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, once again, I think the betting line's accurate. I think even with the lines not being a pick'em, Miranda Maverick is a solidified favourite. I still feel that both lines are close enough that if you've got a good read on this fight, then you could bet either side. You could either get your plus money on Maycee Barber, or you could get Miranda Maverick at a very small favourite price. And as for where the betting lines move throughout fight week, the lines on this fight since they were released, and this was released a few months ago by the way, but Maverick opened a huge underdog. Instantly the line flipped. Maycee Barber went to plus money. She was then a huge underdog. Money's come back in on Barber, closed it up quite a lot to the point Maverick was around -120, -125. And then overnight, on the night I've obviously recorded this podcast, money's come back in on Maverick, pushed it to -135. The fluctuations on the fight have been absolutely crazy. I expect this to continue, but I wouldn't be surprised if a ton of late money comes in on Maycee Barber and really closes this line up to the point we might even get a -110 pick'em on either side come fight night on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, both women are really young, both women are really developing, and stylistically they clash as well because you've got Barber, who's the striker with a Muay Thai background, although she doesn't really adopt a traditional Muay Thai style inside the cage. Then you've got Miranda Maverick. Her first martial art was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, so that's where she's developed from. But both fighters are rounding the games out nicely. Barber is developing well with her wrestling and her grappling, especially offensively. And on the flip side, Maverick's really making big steps in developments in her own striking. And her striking starting to look really solid. And for me, this is the key in this fight. Because Maycee Barber, she's the more dangerous striker. She's got the more power. She's aggressive. She'll come forward. And like I say, she's the fighter with the striking background. But Miranda Maverick, although that she doesn't have the power and the aggression of Maycee Barber, I feel that her developments have actually made her the more technical striker. Now, that doesn't mean that she's the better striker, because Maycee Barber probably is the more effective striker, and it's the effectiveness of the striking that matters. If one fighter's technical but the other fighter's effective, then the fighter that's effective is going to be the one landing the better strikes. But still, the developments of Maverick in her striking and her technical striking now makes this fight very close from a striking perspective, much closer than what we would have been talking about if it was a couple of years ago. So for me, although I do think that Maycee Barber has the slight advantages in the striking now, I do still think that the striking is so close that other elements and other factors in MMA are going to come into play in this fight, and one of those is going to be the grappling. I feel that Miranda Maverick is the better grappler by a long way here. I think if she can put Maycee Barber on her back, we're going to see the gap in skill in the grappling department. And this is the biggest gap in skill in the fight. Not the striking, it's the grappling. And the thing is with Barber, Barber's style is come forward, be aggressive. She needs to get a win. She's lost 2 on the bounce. So she's going to be in the face of Maverick. But actually what that's going to do with how she crashes into her opponents, she allows the distance to be closed. And that's exactly what Maverick wants. Maverick wants this distance to be closed. She wants to be close to Barber, to get a hold of her, to trip her down to the mat and get on top. So I feel stylistically with how Barber's going to come forward aggressively, wild, throwing big power, it's going to close the distance for Maverick and allow her to get the opportunities she needs to get the fight down to the mat. And I think that Maverick takes those opportunities to get the fight to the mat. I think she'll be able to control Barber on the mat. I don't think she's a huge submission threat, Maverick, on top, but she will go from position to position nicely. And of course she will look for submission opportunities, but she'll also be landing ground and pound as well. I think that Barber's going to steal around along the way, but I think that when you look at this fight stylistically, I think Maverick holds that edge, and she also holds advantages in the area with the biggest gap in skill. And it's for those reasons I'm picking Miranda Maverick to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Mickey Gall versus Jordan Williams. Jordan Williams is currently the minus 165 favourite. The comeback on Gall at plus 145 as the underdog. Now, as for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value sits with the underdog in Mickey Gall at plus 145. The line should be much closer, in my opinion. If it was a pick him, it'd make more sense. But again, like I said with Darren Elkins, if Mickey Gall was a slight minus 120, minus 125 favourite, I don't think the line would be off at all. And as for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, a lot of money has come in on Mickey Gall over the last few days. He was a plus 175 favourite not long ago, so you can see with it now being at plus 145 where the money's coming in. But there has now been a little bit of fluctuation. There's now a little bit of money coming in on Jordan Williams. Now he's not a minus 200 favourite, so there is that fluctuation. I do see it continuing. I don't think this line is going to close massively. I do think Mickey Gall is going to enter the cage at roughly around that plus 135, plus 140 mark, maybe even the plus 145 he's currently sitting at now. And as for how the fight plays out, the first thing that's really intriguing for me is that Jordan Williams has got type 1 diabetes, and it was known that he can't cut weight, and that's why he fought at middleweight and was constantly coming in at around 182 pounds. So he was a very small middleweight, but because of the diabetes, he couldn't cut weight to 170. Now, this fight is actually at 170 pounds, so I'm not sure whether he's now in the UFC and they've got the Performance Center and some real good experts over there that can help him get down naturally to 170, so he's not putting his body, he's not putting himself in too much harm. He can't be putting himself in too much harm. Why would you? So it's going to be really interesting actually to see what Jordan Williams looks like at 170 pounds, because he was massively undersized in my opinion at middleweight. Now with Jordan Williams, he's got a wrestling background. He's very aggressive on the feet as well. He's a fighter that loves to get in his opponent's face, really put the pressure on his opponents, put a pace on, hit them with hard shots in the face. And then obviously if he does need to go to his wrestling, which he doesn't normally actively offensively wrestle, at least he hasn't recently anyway. So he is a fighter that's more than happy to keep the fight vertical, but he seems to use his wrestling from a defensive perspective, and he can be difficult to take down. Now with Mickey Gall initially, his base was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. That's what he came into the UFC with. He was a grappler, but since he's been in the UFC, he has developed quite a lot with his striking, to the point that when he fought Mike Perry, I thought Mike Perry was either going to knock him out or Mickey Gall was going to take Perry down and submit him. But actually what happened was the complete opposite. Mickey Gall looked like the better striker against Mike Perry, which was surprising. And Perry was actually the one shooting takedowns and looking like the better grappler. So you can really see that Mickey Gall's put a lot of work in with his striking and with his grappling to back that up as well, because at a certain level in the UFC, Mickey Gall will be a superior grappler. And I feel that this fight is at that level. I think that Jordan Williams has got a lot of development to do. I still think that we see moments in fights where he's very green. I still think that he tires late in fights as well. Mickey Gall can tire also, but that cardio is another thing that he's worked on over his last few fights, and he doesn't look as bad as what he did a couple of fights ago. So I think that Mickey Gall's going to be able to match Jordan Williams on the feet with his improved striking, and I think that Gall's going to be able to have success with his grappling as well, but it might have to be later in the fight when Jordan Williams is a little bit more tired, because Jordan Williams does have decent defensive wrestling. He can stuff a takedown. So I think the fight's going to be really close in the initial stages in this fight, but as both fighters put on volume and really get to work, I do think that the experience of Gall and the cardio of Williams will allow Gall to start looking better the longer the fight goes on. And for those reasons, I'm picking Mickey Gall to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got a fun one. We've got Punahele, Soriano versus Brendan Allen. The betting line is a minus 110 pick'em on either side. As for where the value is on that betting line, honestly, if you've got a good read on this fight, then either side is definitely bettable, as long as, like I say, as you've got that good read. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, this line's been flip-flopping, fluctuating constantly since it was released. In fact, actually, Brendan Allen opened a pretty sizable underdog. All that money came back in on him, pushed it to a pick'em. Then we've seen Brendan Allen at plus 100. We've seen Soriano at plus 100. We've seen either fighter minus 105, minus 115. Now it's sitting as a minus 110 pick'em on either side. So it's literally going to keep fluctuating all week. I honestly think come fight night on Saturday night that either fighter could legitimately be at that plus 100, plus 105 mark. No idea which fighter that's going to be, but either way, the fight is going to close from a betting perspective. As for how this fight plays out, honestly, whichever fighter manages to implement their game plan in this fight is going to win. And I know that's a bit of a cliche, but you've got Soriano, who has a wrestling background, but he keeps fights on the feet. He's explosive with his striking. He's got power in his hands. He'll throw combinations. He'll be aggressive, push forwards, get in the face of his opponents. Whereas Brendan Allen is the complete opposite. His striking is developing. That is one thing I've noticed. I'll touch upon that in a moment. But Brendan Allen is a solid wrestler. He's a solid grappler. He can get fights down to the mat. And when he's on the mat, he can make some mistakes from time to time in regards to leaving gaps for his opponents to escape and explode back to the feet. But for the most part, Brendan Allen is a solid grappler with really good submission skills. He'll land ground and pound if he can't find a submission opportunity. But if he does find a submission opportunity, he will take it. He'll get you out of there. He's submitted some really good fighters. So it's almost a case of striker versus... In fact, it is a case of striker versus grappler. Now, what I mentioned just a moment ago with Brendan Allen, he's now had a few fight camps at Sanford MMA, which I feel is important for Brendan Allen. I think the first fight that he had at Sanford MMA, he ended up fighting Strickland and he ended up getting TKO'd. He got finished. The striking of Strickland was just too good. And I always say this when a fighter moves to a really big gym from his local gym or his usual gym, that they need a couple of fights and a couple of fight camps for you to really start seeing improvements. And I think that's exactly what's happened with Brendan Allen. He didn't look like he improved his striking at all in that Sean Strickland fight, although Strickland is a good striker himself. But you go back and watch the Carl Roberson fight, now that's a different striking performance, and Roberson is another good, clean, crisp kickboxer. And Brendan Allen was landing some nice strikes. Everything seemed a little bit tighter. His technique was a little bit more polished, and he actually looked like a decent striker in there before the fight hit the mat and he submitted Carl Roberson. So I feel that Allen is making improvements in the areas that he needs to. Now, Punahele Soriano, like I say, he's got a wrestling background as well, so it's not going to be easy for Allen to take him down. I think Allen would have to look for more trip takedowns opposed to single legs and double legs. I don't think that's going to work too easily against Soriano. But I think Allen could potentially match Soriano on the feet with the improvements I've seen in the striking. But he does, of course, run the risk of getting knocked out. But the striking, as I said earlier with Maverick and Barber, the striking in this fight is now much closer than what it would have been a year ago. So I think with the striking improvements of Allen, with the big gap in skill that he's got on the mat, as long as he can get it to the mat, with the developments that he's making, he's at a good gym in Sanford MMA, and the experience in this fight is absolutely key. I still think that Soriano shows brief moments where you can tell that he's a developing fighter, where he's a little green, whereas Brendan Allen is a fully fledged, experienced veteran at this point. He's got so many fights under his record. I have to favour the fighter that's definitely more experienced, that's got a big gap in skill on the mat, and that can potentially match or get close to the striking, which is his opponent's path to victory. I'm picking Brendan Allen to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Ian Heinisch versus Nassourdine Imavov. Heinisch is currently the minus 140 favourite. The comeback on Imavov at plus 120 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think that the value sits with the favourite in Heinisch at minus 140. There is an argument that he should be a bigger favourite in this fight, maybe up to minus 170, minus 175. So at minus 140, that's where I see the value on the money line. As for how the betting line moves throughout fight week, there's been a lot of fluctuation in this fight. People like Imavov, and he does have skills and qualities that I think can cause Heinisch problems, which is probably the reason why Heinisch isn't a minus 200, minus 250 favourite in this spot. But it does seem that for every bit of money that starts to come in on Imavov, it does hit a brick wall of where it roughly is now, and then we start to see a flurry of Heinisch bets come in. It's going to fluctuate like that. I ultimately think that Heinisch is going to step into the cage at around minus 150, with Imavov at around plus 130. Now, as for how this fight plays out, when you look at the fighters, the opponents that Ian Heinisch has had in the UFC and the Contender Series as well, he's fought so many defined levels of opponents. He's fought fighters that are levels above him, fighters like Gastelum, fighters like Derek Brunson, who have been at the top of the division for years, and he gives them good fights, but ultimately he can never beat them, and that's because he's not at that level. Then he's fought fighters that are around his sort of level. Fighters like Gerald Meerschaert, fighters like Omari Akhmedov, like Antonio Carlos Jr. And actually, those fights, he's won a couple, he's lost one, the one to Akhmedov he lost, but those fighters are the fighters that are around his own level. And then he's fought fighters that are just nowhere near his level, like your Justin Sumter and, in my opinion, Cesar Ferreira. And with Heinisch, it just seems to be quite obvious that he's this really solid mid-tier fighter where if you beat him, then you're going to go on to do big things. And if you don't beat him, then you go to the back of the queue and you've got some learning, some developments to do, almost like a gatekeeper role. But Heinisch, for me, he's a solid fighter, but he is that mid-tier fighter where he'll either get fighters fighting him that are either much better or much worse from a levels perspective, and then from time to time he'll be fighting fighters roughly around his own skill set and ability where the fights will be close and you'll just think, well, this fight could go either way. But this fight with Imavov for me is the complete opposite spectrum from Gastelum last time out. Gastelum was levels above Ian Heinisch, but this time it's Heinisch that is levels above his opponent in Imavov. Now Imavov, in my opinion, isn't a bad fighter, and he's actually got a good skill set and he's got some good abilities, especially with his striking. He's tall, he's long, he strikes well from the outside, but then he'll burst forwards as well, throwing big hooks. He's a decent striker, but the thing is, like I said, in MMA there's levels, and Ian Heinisch is just a level above where Imavov's at. In regards to the striking, Heinisch might not be as technical, but he's more effective. He'll get into range, he'll walk through a storm, he'll get a hit to be able to hit his opponent. That's not always a great thing, but with Heinisch, who's got good durability, he can get inside that boxing range, maybe take a few shots coming in, but then he'll land his own combinations to the head, to the body, and he'll really cause problems inside that boxing range for the taller fighter. And then with Heinisch as well, he's always got the option to go to his wrestling. He's got really good wrestling. We saw him take Gastelum down a couple of times with blast double legs. He even took Omari Akhmedov down 3 times as well, and Akhmedov's a good wrestler. And then in regards to his jiu-jitsu, once the fight hits the mat, his jiu-jitsu is really good. We saw him get taken down by Antonio Carlos Jr. 4 times, but he was able to remain safe. And Carlos Jr., I know he's no longer with the UFC, but Carlos Jr. is a black belt in BJJ, a solid black belt with great submissions. Heinisch managed to stay safe against Antonio Carlos Jr. and get back up to his feet. And even Heinisch scored a takedown against Carlos Jr. as well. So Heinisch is good everywhere. And like I said, he's not at the level of your likes of Gastelum or Brunson, but he's also levels above where Imavov's coming from. I think Imavov will be able to cause Heinisch problems on the feet in moments, but it won't be long, especially if Heinisch, for whatever reason, if Heinisch starts to get beat on the feet and starts to get pieced up, tagged up, he'll just go to his wrestling. We've seen Imavov get taken down. We've seen him get tired because he gets taken down as well. And I just don't see any reason why Heinisch can't come into this fight, level change, take him down, or just even grind him up against the cage for 3 rounds if he needs to, if there's no finish. Imavov might take a round throughout this fight, but I don't think he's going to be able to take 2 out of the 3 rounds or 3 out of the 3 rounds. I think it's going to be really tough for him to finish Heinisch as well, who is durable, who is a dog fighter. I think stylistically, Heinisch is favoured in this fight. I think that Heinisch has got more ways to win this fight. He's more experienced. I just genuinely think he's the better fighter in each area as well. And for those reasons, I'm going to pick Ian Heinisch to win this fight. And in the next fight, we finally get to the people's main event. Dr. Pepper versus Reese's Chocolates. We've got Adrian Yanez versus Randy Costa. Yanez is currently the minus 225 favourite. They'll come back on Costa at plus 185 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, actually and unfortunately, I do think the betting line is relatively accurate. I would have wanted to have said that I wish the betting line was much closer, but I don't think it is. I do think Yanez is the better fighter. The longer the fight goes on, I'll talk more about this in the breakdown, but I think that Yanez does have a bigger win condition in this fight. I understand why he's a minus 225 favourite. I still definitely think Randy Costa's dangerous. All it needs is one solid shot from Costa, and he's got the ability and the power to put his opponent out. So if you're playing the plus 185 of Costa, I do actually understand that side too. For me, the line's just fairly accurate. As for where it moves throughout fight week, the line was much shorter a few days ago. It's now got wider. Money came in on Yanez, but now the trend is currently money coming back in on Costa. And again, I get it. I think there's going to be some fluctuation here. Ultimately, I think Yanez is going to go into the fight roughly at around minus 200, minus 210, with Costa sitting at around plus 175. Now, as for how this fight plays out, I think it's going to be a banger. I think it's going to be fun. Both fighters have been being at each other backwards and forwards on Twitter in a really fun way. There's no animosity or anything, and it's actually quite refreshing to see it. They've been retweeting everything that everybody's posting about the fight and causing a real big scenario with this fight, and I love it, and it's created anticipation to the fact that hardcore fans just cannot wait to see these two guys throw down, and I think they will throw down. I don't think it's a fight where we're going to see any wrestling or grappling unless one fighter gets hurt and they shoot a panic takedown or something like that. I think the fight's going to be won and lost on the feet. I think both fighters hold a ton of power. Both fighters have got good technique, but there is still question marks on Randy Costa, and I love Randy Costa. He's a good dude, he's an exciting fighter, and he cashed big for me last time out against Journey Newson at plus money, so I love Costa, but there's still a few questions that I have with Costa, especially if the fight gets out of round one. Now, I know Costa's been working hard at multiple gyms, he's been putting the work in, so from a cardio perspective, if he's calmed things down inside the cage and he doesn't go as hard in round one, then he might have fixed those cardio issues. It's just we haven't seen it because he finishes his fights early. He's finished both of his last fights really early, so we haven't seen him get out of round one and what he looks like in round 2 and 3, so that's why the questions are still there. I'm not saying the issue's still there, I'm just saying we haven't seen him, physically seen him with our eyes, fix the issues that he had. Now with Yanez, I know that Yanez can go 3 hard rounds. I know Yanez can keep that pace and pressure up and that volume up as well. And this is why I believe that Yanez is a minus 225 favourite, because not only has he proven he can go 3 rounds, he's proven he can go 3 rounds hard. He is a phenomenal boxer. I think he holds the speed advantage here. I think the one-punch knockout power actually sits with Randy Costa, but Yanez, I think, has the volume advantage. I think he has a speed advantage, a movement advantage, and potentially a cardio advantage as well. So although the fight's going to be fireworks and Randy Costa could easily just connect with a punch on Yanez's chin and knock him out in that first round in an exchange, it could happen, and that's why plus 185 is a good line for a dangerous fighter. But it's just if that knockout doesn't happen, which in the lower divisions they don't always happen, you can't always depend on that. If this fight does exit into round 2 and 3, you have to favour Yanez with what we've seen with our eyes, and that's why Yanez is a minus 225 favourite. I think he's the slightly more technical fighter and he'll be the faster fighter, and that should allow him to remain relatively safe, get deeper into the fight and really put it on Randy Costa. For those reasons, I am going to side with Dr. Pepper. I'm picking Adrian Yanez to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Julio Arce versus Andre Ewell. Arce is currently the minus 200 favourite. The comeback on Ewell at plus 170 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, once again, I think the line's accurate. I think the bookies have got it right. I think the public line movement's right as well. I do agree with Arce being a minus 200 favourite. If you're going to push me for a value side here, which one's the better bet? I would probably edge towards Andre Ewell at plus 170 being a better bet than Julio Arce. But like I said, the line is accurate in my opinion. It's where it should be. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I think we're going to see some fluctuation now, but I don't think the line's going to ping off in any particular direction. We might see some people looking to bet Andre Ewell at plus 170. I definitely wouldn't hate those bets, but Julio Arce at plus 200, there might be a little bit of money come back in on him if people bet Ewell. So ultimately, I think the line's going to stay roughly where it is come fight night on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, before I actually watched tape on this fight, I was leaning Andre Ewell at plus 170. It was a big number and I just didn't think he warranted it. But actually, when I watched tape on Ewell, and I like Ewell, but I almost think that sometimes I overrate Ewell in my head and think he's better than what he actually performs at inside the cage. And I don't mean any disrespect there. In fact, probably the opposite. You know, I really like Ewell. I think he's a quality fighter, but actually he does have some bad tendencies inside the cage, and one of them is the fact of how much he slows down. Round 1, Andre Ewell is a problem for every fighter in the division. Ewell in round 1, he's got sick movement, in and out of range. His speed is insane. His volume's insane. His accuracy is insane. Round 1, Andre Ewell is a massive problem. And I fully expect Andre Ewell to come into this fight and take the first round from Julio Arce. But it's what happens after that. It's almost like he puts so much of his effort into that first round that his cardio and volume just drops off a cliff. And I'm not saying his cardio's terrible to the point where his hands are on his knees and he's struggling to breathe, but you can visibly see the drop off in his volume and his output, and that's due to the fact that his cardio is just suffering a little bit. And I think that this is where Julio Arce is going to really take over this fight. I think Arce is going to drop round 1 to Ewell, but once Ewell starts dropping off himself in regards to that activity and volume, that's when Arce is really going to push forwards. He's going to land some nice low kicks. That is another blueprint for how to really nullify Andre Ewell as well. Kick his long legs. He's got long legs. He has a wide stance, and we've seen fighters kick his legs and hurt his legs. You stop the movement, you stop the speed, and it allows you to take over the fight. I think what's going to happen in this fight is Julio Arce is going to drop that round 1. He's going to come into round 2. He's going to start getting off on some nice strikes, low kicks, closing the distance, getting into boxing range, landing some nice shots inside of range, stepping back out of range, firing some kicks from the outside, and just really starting to put his activity and volume together. I think if Julio Arce really does some nice work in round 2, it's going to allow him to really start putting the pressure on in round 3, and he should be able to take round 3 relatively easily. I think it's going to be one of those fights where you could even potentially live bet it as well, because after round 1, Andre Ewell, in my opinion, should be looking phenomenal in the eyes of the bookies. But actually what they might not know is that drop-off's going to happen and Julio Arce is going to take over the fight. That's honestly what I see happening. I'm picking Julio Arce to win this fight. And in the next fight, we've got Sijara Eubanks versus the newcomer, Elise Reed. Eubanks is currently the -325 favourite. The comeback on Reed at +265 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, honestly, I think I kind of get the line. I kind of understand why Eubanks is a -325 favourite. Wider in some books as well. Obviously, she's the one with the UFC experience and she's the one that's fought the better quality opponents. But honestly, laying -325 on Sijara Eubanks is insane in my opinion. I don't think Elise Reed is bad enough to really truly warrant that -325 line. Like I say, I can see both sides of this. I can understand why the -300 line's there, but at the same time, I think it's too wide as well. But I also don't think it's wide enough where people should be going smashing Elise Reed at the +265 line either. I think it's one of those fights that's genuinely an easy pass. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, I don't think it's going to move too much if I'm being honest, purely because I don't think Sijara Eubanks is that attractive as a -325 favourite for people to be going smashing money on her. And then on the flip side, I don't think Elise Reed, I don't think she's going to be having people rush into the betting window to lay money on her, even at +265. So I don't think the betting line's going to move too much. I think it's going to stay roughly where it is right about now. As for how the fight plays out, Elise Reed, she looks like an okay fighter if I'm being honest. She's got decent striking, good fundamentals. When she gets on top of her opponents, she can be quite dangerous with ground and pound, and she passes, guard, position from position, her transitions are good. So she's a well-rounded fighter and she's okay. I actually think that she's going to win some fights in the UFC. I don't think she's a fighter that's just been brought in for Eubanks to give her a 3-fight contract and then just let her see her contract out and give her bad fights. I don't think she's a fighter that's been brought in for that reason. I think she can win fights in the UFC, but with that being said, this is a relatively difficult debut for her. Even though Eubanks hasn't got the best record, she's also fought some of the best fighters. She's experienced. She's up there in age, but with that age, like I said, comes with that experience. She's got skills and qualities in all facets of MMA. I think that Eubanks is probably going to be the better striker here. I think she's going to be the better wrestler. I think she'll be the better grappler. And ultimately, this is why we're seeing the -325 line, because I do think that Eubanks is slightly better in every single area. Where Elise Reed might be able to really take advantage in this fight is if Eubanks' gas tank problems come back, because Eubanks has tired in the past. She has looked great in round 1, and then halfway through round 2, her cardio starts to fall off a cliff. At that point, if Elise Reed's still fresh and not too beaten up, she's going to be able to start taking over the fight. That's where it could be relatively close. But honestly, I just think that Eubanks is going to have a lot of things her way in this fight, and it's normally in those fights where fighters don't tire as much because everything's going to plan, everything's going your way, you're not having too much resistance coming back at you. So I think that Eubanks is in a good spot in this fight. I just don't think that you can really trust her at the -325 line. The line's too wide in my opinion. Either way, regardless, I'm picking Sijara Eubanks to win this fight. And in the final breakdown of this card, we've got Diana Belbita versus the returning Hannah Goldie. Hannah Goldie is currently the -120 favourite. The comeback on Belbita at +100 as the underdog. As for where the value is on the betting line, I do think the value slightly sits with Belbita. Again, the line's quite accurate in my opinion. I genuinely think that the bookies and the public line movement have been absolutely spot on for this card. I don't think there's many fighters that have got really horrific lines. This fight for me is another fight that's lined accurately, but if you are going to push me for a value side, I would say the value side is with the plus money in Diana Belbita. As for where the betting line moves throughout fight week, the current trend right now is the money on Belbita. She was sitting at +150 just a couple of days ago, so all that money's come back in on Belbita, pushed her to a +100 underdog. I kind of agree with that trend, but I don't think that it's going to continue over to cause a line flip. So I do see a bit of fluctuation here. I think people will bet Goldie now. She's a -120 favourite and not a -150 favourite, but I don't think it's going to go too far. There'll be a little bit of fluctuation. Ultimately, I expect the line to close roughly where it's sitting right about now come fight night on Saturday night. Now, as for how this fight plays out, it's going to be interesting because I really don't think either fighter's rounded the game out that well at this point. I think both fighters definitely need to develop as fighters inside the cage. They both need cage time, and I think that both fighters have got the holes, but against each other, I think they've both got the strengths as well. So on the feet, on the outside, Hannah Goldie is just going to throw kicks to the body and the head. I think her best path to victory is trying to stay on the outside and just kick inwards. That's where she has the most success. But Diana Belbita is a forward pressure fighter. I think that she will get hit with some kicks while she's closing the distance, but ultimately she will close the distance. She'll get inside, she'll land some punches. That's where Goldie looks a little bit flustered inside boxing range. She can throw hands and she'll throw power in her hands as well, but it's really with her kicks where she looks most comfortable. She doesn't look as comfortable inside boxing range. But then Belbita will look to go to a wrestling, she'll look to go to a grappling, and in her last fight against Liana Jojua, that fight just really didn't work out for her. She took Jojua down, she got armbarred. It looked quite bad if I'm being honest, but the thing is with Hannah Goldie, I don't think that Goldie's going to be able to pose those same submission threats off her back as what someone like Jojua did. So I think that Belbita's safer in this fight to go for a takedown and get some top control time. Goldie, for me, I just don't think she's going to go to a wrestling. I think she's, as I've mentioned a few times already, way more comfortable on the feet, striking with her kicks on the outside. And for me, that gives Belbita more paths to victory in this fight, more ways to win the fight. I think Belbita could win it by constantly closing the distance, getting inside boxing range and landing some nice punches, taking away those kicks of Goldie. And then I also think Belbita could take Goldie down and get some top control time without having to worry too much about a submission off her back. Again, taking the kicks and that path to victory away from Goldie as well. I think Belbita's just got more ways to win this fight. I'm picking Diana Belbita to win this fight. And that's all for this episode of On the Money Line. I hope you all enjoyed it, and as always, fight fans, I'd appreciate all the likes to the video and subscriptions to our MMA Play 365 YouTube channel too. If I've ever helped you with some analysis, or if I've ever helped you pick a fighter and make you some money, just drop a subscription. I'd really appreciate it. Remember, you can get all the betting advice you'll ever need over at MMAplay365.com. We cater for long-term gamblers that like to build their own bets and strategies, gamblers that just want to follow exactly what I bet on, and we also cater for you fun gamblers that like the long shot fun parlays, or ACCAs, accumulators as we call them in the UK. Even if you only want our best value underdog for the event, which comes with a money back guarantee, by the way, we have plenty of different packages and subscription options for you guys to choose from, which also includes our DFS packages for DraftKings and FanDuel as well. All our subscriptions are at very affordable prices. Just hop onto MMAplay365.com and see what's best for you. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you at the next event.